Rabbi Tuvia Singer is a rabbi in Israel who, as I understand it, runs an anti-missionary organization, and he has a YouTube channel where he posts responses to various arguments that Christian missionaries tend to make. The format of his videos is a bit strange in that it appears that he's being interviewed live by a radio or podcast host, but the video then cuts to what appears to be a scripted and edited presentation rather than a live response. That doesn't really matter for us, though. I generally find his videos pretty thoughtful, and I think it's certainly a worthwhile effort to help people evaluate claims of missionaries in a rational way. For example, the common claims by Christian apologists that Jesus is prefigured in Old Testament writings certainly needs to be evaluated using the original texts, knowledge of history, patterns of religious movements, and so on, and I think Rabbi Singer generally does this well. But I have wondered whether he evaluates the religious claims of Judaism with the same critical disposition, or whether he chooses to protect his own cherished beliefs from scrutiny. It's not that easy to determine because he does not post much on Jewish apologetics, and I'm not going to wade through all his videos to find remarks that he might make here or there, but I did find this video where a caller asks whether the academic approach that Rabbi Singer takes to the New Testament and claims of Christian apologists should also be applied to the Old Testament, which is basically the same thing that I would have asked. Here's the question.
Very good, Rabbi. We're going to go and move on to the next caller. Max, you are live on the air. Please go ahead with your question.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you, Rabbi, for everything you do. You've been a huge inspiration for me. But the question that I want to ask is, you talk a lot about how the academic consensus on the Old Testament is that it's written by multiple authors, sometimes 100 to 200 years after the supposed events of Christ's life. But then how do you also say that the Tanakh is the inspired word of God when those same academics turn around and say, well, there were actually four authors of the Chumash, and Daniel's written several centuries later, and there's revisions in, Deuteronomy. Thank you.
So first of all, I'm pretty sure the caller misspeaks when he mentions academic consensus on the Old Testament, because then he says that this consensus is that it was written 100 to 200 years after the events of Christ's life. That's certainly not the dating of the Old Testament, according to anyone at all, so I assume he meant New Testament rather than Old Testament. Rabbi Singer doesn't correct him on that, but I don't see what else he could possibly have meant. To me, the question seems pretty clear. If Rabbi Singer uses the academic approach to the Gospels, then why doesn't he use the academic approach to the Hebrew Bible, which of course sees the Bible as a human creation of multiple authors, which at least opens the door to it not literally being the inspired Word of God. In other words, why follow scholarly consensus in one context and not the other? It's a good question. But there is a premise in the question that's actually of some importance to understanding Rabbi Singer's response. The caller assumes that Rabbi Singer does make use of modern scholarship. And I would have thought the same thing from watching Rabbi Singer's videos, but as you'll hear from Rabbi Singer's answer, he's going to say not so much. So let's watch.
So as it turns out, academic scholars in the New Testament generally agree on the time of authorship of the Gospels, for example, with people who are Christians. It means the vast majority of Christians believe that the book of Mark was written about 70, Luke and Matthew about 85, and Acts a little bit later than that, and the book of John. So I don't think there is a very big difference. 7 of the 13 letters of Paul there's a consensus they were written during the 50s. The only question is the authorship of the 6 other books, letters of Paul, like 2 Thessalonians, like Ephesians, Colossians, and the pastoral epistles. So there isn't consensus. My view is that Ephesians, Colossians certainly were written by Paul. I think it's very likely Second Thessalonians written by Paul. I think it's unlikely that the pastoral epistles were written by Paul, but it's possible that he co-edited them. So my view actually is, in terms of time and authorship, is very much consistent with what mainstream evangelicals believe.
Okay, so right there, Rabbi Singer kind of cuts the legs out from under the caller, because the caller starts off his question by basically saying, if you, Rabbi Singer, use modern scholarship in analyzing the Gospels, and then Rabbi Singer says, basically, well, I don't do that. He's basically saying that modern scholarship agrees with Christian tradition, so there's consensus across the board, and he's just following this broad consensus, not academic scholarship in particular, so that's kind of the end of the story right there. But I'm not so sure I'm buying this, because obviously there are some disagreements about something when it comes to Christian tradition versus modern scholarship. Where does Rabbi Singer abandon Christian tradition in favor of modern scholarship? Let's listen a little more.
The authorship part is clearly that they insist that Matthew wrote Matthew, and therefore Matthew was written by an eyewitness. So that is a completely spurious claim. Now, if Christians want to say, I believe it on faith that Matthew and John, both of them were disciples, wrote them, and I believe it, they're welcome to believe that, and that's fine. But where Christians get themselves into trouble is when they say that because Matthew was written by Matthew and John written by John, son of Zebedee, Matthew the tax collector, and therefore we have an eyewitness account. That's where they get into trouble, because they're now making a claim, and that's a reason for me to believe that. And if there's no reason to believe that, because those books are written anonymously, that's where they get into a whole bunch of trouble.
Okay, Rabbi Singer says this whole bunch of trouble line many, many times in this video, but he oddly never says exactly what the trouble is. I mean, is it the kind of trouble that academic scholarship would cause for these traditional attributions? If not, then what's the trouble? I wish he would say. But anyway, there is something that confuses me here. So put the dating aside for a second. Christian tradition is that the disciples of Jesus, or close associates, people who were alive at the same time Jesus was alive, those people wrote the Gospels. That is the Christian tradition, and that tradition goes way back, as far as we can determine, possibly mentioned by Papias, who was writing about 100 years after the death of Jesus. So although the books themselves don't state who their author is in the text, they have basically always been attributed to certain close associates of Jesus or people in that immediate circle. That is the Christian tradition. Now, whatever dating Christian tradition uses would have to be consistent with that. Even in religious traditions, books aren't written by dead people. So what matters is not the dating, but the authorship. Was the book written, or let's say maybe composed, by an eyewitness to Jesus? Christians say yes. It is modern scholarship which says no. And academic scholars say no for a lot of reasons relating to the type of Greek in which these books are written, references that seem to locate the books in a different context from Second Temple Palestine, and so on. It's certainly not my expertise, but you can go read about it. I'm guessing Bart Ehrman has a book or two on the topic. So here's the point. Whether or not Rabbi Singer agrees with any Christians about dates is incidental. He disagrees with Christians and agrees with modern scholarship on the most important point, which is that the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts. So why not just say that? Why would Rabbi Singer not just say that critical scholarship is correct in its determination that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses and were written in a different time and place?
Matthew's, for instance, written not only anonymously, but when Matthew's mentioned, he's only mentioned once in Matthew 9:9, he's spoken of in the third person. Now, that would be fine if he's spoken of in the third person, as long as at the end of the book of Matthew, it said something like, and these words were given to Matthew.
Why would that make a difference? Couldn't anyone write, and these words were given to Matthew? What prevents someone who isn't Matthew from writing exactly that? Is that really the problem that Rabbi Singer has with the authenticity of the gospel? that it doesn't say, these are the words of Matthew? I mean, if tomorrow someone discovered a gospel manuscript that had at the end, these are the words of Matthew, would Rabbi Singer be like, well, okay then, I guess we do have a genuine eyewitness account? I mean, I find that really hard to believe that it would make that much of a difference to him.
Or Matthew wrote down all these words. Like Matthew 28 ends with the Great Commission, right? So if somewhere there it said, and these words were given to Matthew, fine. Then the third person would just be a literary method, and that's fine. But it's not there. There's nothing like that. In contrast,
and here we go.
Conversely, lahavdil, the Torah, the authorship, we are told explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 9 and verse 24, that Moses wrote down the whole Torah. He wrote down a scroll for each tribe and one that went into the Ark of the Covenant.
Okay, first of all, so what? What would prevent anyone who wasn't Moses from writing this? And on its face, you would think that this very verse was in fact not written by Moses, since it refers to him in the third person, as most of the Bible does. Academic scholars believe that Deuteronomy was in fact written long after the time that Moses allegedly lived. And the opening verses of Deuteronomy clearly situate the author of Deuteronomy on the other side of the Jordan from where Moses would have been at that time. It says, these are the words that Moses spoke to the Israelites on the other side of the Jordan. The author is clearly writing from the west side of the Jordan, where Moses never set foot. According to the story, Moses and the Israelites are, at this time, on the east side of the Jordan. Moses did not write this. And look, if someone wants to say that it's a later editorial insertion by someone having already settled in Canaan, well, fine. But then you've opened the door to authorship by individuals who lived long after Moses, so welcome to academic scholarship. And the verse that Rabbi Singer mentioned says not the Torah, but this Torah, which means this teaching. What teaching is that referring to? Most likely, it's just the book of Deuteronomy or some portion of it. That phrase, this Torah, is pretty much restricted to Deuteronomy, where it's introduced in verse 5 of chapter 1, but it's not exactly clear what it refers to in every setting. In Deuteronomy 4:8, it refers just to whatever the Israelites heard on that day at Sinai, or Horeb, as it's called in Deuteronomy. That would not have been the entire Pentateuch. In 7:3, this Torah refers to words that the Israelites are supposed to inscribe on plaster-coated stones when they cross the Jordan, which is reflected also in Joshua 8:32. It is scarcely believable that this could mean the entire Pentateuch, and it might just be referring to the set of curses that follows from verse 15 to verse 26. And shortly following the verse that Rabbi Singer cites, Moses commands that this Torah be read aloud to all the men, women, and children every 7th year when they make their pilgrimage. It's rather absurd, I think, to imagine that this could refer to the entire Pentateuch, which would probably take about 12 hours to read. Frankly, in almost all cases where it refers to this Torah, it seems to be referring to a succinct set of laws or injunctions or something of that nature, which is why it often says that you should observe and perform it. It's almost certainly not referring to vast tracts of folklore and mythology and tabernacle construction that make up so much of the Bible we now have. But you know what? That's all really irrelevant, because anyone at all could write, Moses wrote this teaching, and it tells us nothing at all about the actual events that transpired. It's kind of hard to believe that Rabbi Singer is actually this credulous, but maybe he is.
Now, why people, and I have friends who are a little silly out there, but they're buddies of mine who do videos on this, and they can't figure that. I don't know why. I don't understand why people don't get that the Torah clearly states the author. It's in the text.
Yes, it's in the text, just like it's in the text of Moby Dick that Ishmael narrated the events of Moby Dick. But what does that tell us about the actual Ishmael and what he actually did? You can write whatever you want to write in a book. It doesn't have to be real. I think Rabbi Singer must realize this, and we'll see later he does realize it when it comes to Christian writings.
Now, you can believe it or not believe it, but the text says it. Conversely, Matthew does not say it was written by Matthew anywhere. There's no reason to believe that Matthew was written by Matthew, and there's very good reason to believe that Irenaeus, a second century church father, he was the bishop of Lyon, which is modern day France, made that up and erroneously based it on a church father, probably on a church father named Papias, and a little bit earlier in the second century. There's no reason to believe otherwise. It's the Catholic tradition the Protestants just adopted.
So let me get that straight. A textual tradition that we can trace back almost all the way to the time of Jesus, that the Gospels were written by certain individuals in his inner circle, is not evidence for anything at all in the view of Rabbi Singer, but the tradition that Moses wrote the Bible, for which we have no attestation for more than 1,000 years after Moses allegedly lived. That tradition is 100% verified because the Torah says Moses wrote this. I do sense that there is a double standard here. And, Rabbi Singer's silly friends who doubt Mosaic authorship might not be so silly. There are so many indications that Moses was not, in fact, the author of the Bible. He's not mentioned anywhere as being the author of Genesis or Leviticus. He's not mentioned as writing down more than very specific portions of Exodus or Numbers. The vast majority of the first 4 books of the Pentateuch don't give any indication of who wrote them, and that's kind of a big red flag for Rabbi Singer, at least when it comes to Christian scripture. Even Deuteronomy, which does contain attribution of this Torah to Moses, still narrates his death, is situated in the wrong location, and contradicts many points of law allegedly taught by Moses in the other books of the Torah with complete unawareness. There are a number of retrospective remarks that make it clear that the author is not writing in the lifetime of Moses. And the biblical narrative is filled with so many redundancies and contradictions, including matters that the character Moses himself could not possibly have been confused about, such as the location of the tent of meeting, the name of his father-in-law, the length of time that the Israelites were in Egypt, and so on, that it is absolutely reasonable and frankly necessary to assume that a single person named Moses did not write this entire work, regardless of whether it's in the text that he did. And even if the entire Pentateuch were consistently written from Moses' first-person perspective, as in, "Behold, I, Moses, will now relate the account of creation as God told it to me," and even if it did so without any contradictions or anachronisms, in perfect, seamless narrative, would you really be that impressed by the fact that a book attributes its authorship to someone in that way? We know it was common practice in the ancient world to assign authorship to famous personalities. Scholars have a term for this, pseudepigrapha. And even today, people write books from the perspective of fictional characters. I mean, Timon and Pumbaa narrate Lion King 1.5. The superhero Deadpool narrates his movie. Are we supposed to be deeply impressed by this? Authors are quite creative in how they handle viewpoint and perspective. But again, I have to stress that if you put aside your prior ideological commitments or faith commitments or whatever, and just read the Bible with fresh eyes, the overwhelming sense you get is that from Exodus on, this is a book about Moses and the Israelites, not a book by Moses. Occasionally, the character Moses is said to write down certain things at certain times, but it never indicates he wrote the whole thing. And again, the only thing we actually know about Moses is that he is a character in a book.
And as far as timing goes, well, Isaiah is a problem for those who are not of faith.
Okay, so now we are clearly switching gears. To summarize, though, Rabbi Singer's argument for the Torah's authenticity over and above the Gospel's authenticity is that, hey, it says Moses wrote it. But actually, we have every reason to think Moses did not write it, and no evidence whatsoever to suppose that Moses wrote it. Best evidence is that Moses is simply a character in the book. Maybe he existed, maybe he didn't, but he did not write the book. So, I'd have to say Rabbi Singer is very unconvincing on this point. I do wonder what the caller thought about his response. So, on to Isaiah. How does Isaiah demonstrate that the Pentateuch did not have multiple human authors as modern scholarship surmises?
I mean, the book of Isaiah makes statements that the prophet would not have access to unless he was, in fact, a Navi, a prophet who was receiving divine inspiration.
So let me pause for a minute and see what happened here. Let's go back to the caller's question.
Very good, Rabbi. We're going to go and move on to the next caller. Max, you are live on the air. Please go ahead with your question.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you, Rabbi, for everything you do. You've been a huge inspiration for me. But the question that I want to ask is, you talk a lot about how the academic consensus on the Old Testament is that it's written by multiple authors, sometimes 100 to 200 years after the supposed events of Christ's life. But then how do you also say that the Tanakh is the inspired word of God when those same academics turn around and say, well, there are actually 4 authors of the Chumash, and Daniel's written several centuries later, and there's revisions in Deuteronomy? Thank you.
Okay, so the caller didn't specifically ask about Isaiah, but I'm guessing that Rabbi Singer is addressing the question of why he doesn't follow academic scholarship for dating the books of Tanakh, and Isaiah is an example of one where scholarly consensus sees multiple authors. Now, I don't see how addressing Isaiah would really illuminate anything beyond Isaiah in terms of Tanakh being divinely inspired or not, but let's hear what Rabbi Singer has to say. Carry on.
The most famous text is Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1. That's one verse follows the other, which speaks about Cyrus, who lived a little less than 2 centuries after Isaiah. And Isaiah, by name, says that he's going to call the Jewish people to return and build the temple and rebuild Yerushalayim. And in fact, that's why Cyrus knows that he's supposed to do that, is because he's mentioned in the book, which is very important. Once you say that Isaiah is written by multiple authors, you're kicking out the legs of history of what compels Cyrus to tell the Jews go back. Well, he had this book that was not quite 200 years old that named him.
Whoa. Wait a minute. Let's get this straight. Rabbi Singer is making the claim that Cyrus of Persia read the book of Isaiah and discovered in there that he, Cyrus, was going to let the Jews return to Jerusalem in the future. And therefore he was compelled to do this. That is amazing. And by amazing, I mean amazingly ridiculous. What is the evidence that Cyrus read about himself in the Hebrew Bible and decided to follow through on what he read there? Exactly nothing. What do we know about Cyrus? From the Cyrus Cylinder, we know that Cyrus had a policy of returning idols or images to their original temples and allowing some peoples to return to their homelands. There is no indication this refers to the Jews specifically, and certainly no mention that Cyrus was motivated by Isaiah or the Bible. Cyrus was a worshiper of Marduk, and in the Cyrus Cylinder he refers to being commanded by Marduk to undertake his actions. Nothing surprising about that. No mention of the Bible, Isaiah, or Yahweh. I mean, wouldn't you think that if Cyrus was that flabbergasted by a prophecy about himself that he read in the Hebrew Scriptures, of all places, he might have mentioned this somewhere? especially since the prophecy to Cyrus presented in Isaiah goes on and on about, I am Yahweh, there is no one else. I, Yahweh, do these things. I will give you treasures concealed in the dark and secret hoards, so that you will know that it is I, Yahweh. So you kind of think that if Cyrus read this prophecy and was going to say thank you to someone, it would not be Marduk. And in the first chapter of Ezra, where it presents Cyrus's decision to release the Jews to resettle Judah, does it mention anything about Cyrus seeing a prophecy of himself from Isaiah? Nope. What about in 2 Chronicles chapter 36? Nope. The book of Daniel is set during the reign of Cyrus. Any mention there that Cyrus was reading the Bible? Nope. Did any of the biblical books composed after Isaiah pick up on this critical prophecy? Nope. Would the later Ezekiel or Jeremiah have been ignorant of such a specific prophecy right from their own neighborhood while somehow Cyrus of Persia got the word? It's kind of odd, right? I first thought this idea that Cyrus saw the prophecy about himself in Isaiah must be unique to Rabbi Singer, and I was going to say bravo, but then I saw that actually Rashi says this, commenting on the second verse in the book of Ezra, where it has Cyrus's alleged edict returning the Jews to Judah, where Cyrus is reported as writing that Yahweh commanded me to build him a house in Jerusalem. Rashi clarifies that God commanded Cyrus through the prophecy of Isaiah, although, as I mentioned, this is nowhere in the text. Sadia Gaon, who lived 100 years before Rashi was born, says the same thing about the same verse. So maybe that's the source. But why would Sadia come up with such an odd idea? I'm guessing that the notion of God speaking so directly to the person of Cyrus was something that didn't sit right with Sadia. So he makes it less theologically problematical by having the prophecy of Isaiah be the conduit by which the command comes to Cyrus, not God speaking himself. Anyway, the fact remains that there is nothing to support this at all. The idea that Cyrus read Isaiah's prophecy is a complete fiction that Rabbi Singer is propagating. So I find that disappointing for someone who presents themselves as following facts and consensus and so on. This is just a Baba Misa, as they say in Yiddish. If a Christian apologist suggested anything so absurd, Rabbi Singer would shoot it down in 1 second. Anyway, let's go on.
So this is why it's very important. Now, the academic world, you don't have to be an agnostic or atheist to be, but the academic world can only use tools that are accessible. And of course, those tools are not accessible with Isaiah. Now, the academic world, frankly, uses methodologies that are not kosher, in that they say that Isaiah 40 through 66 is different than Isaiah 1 through 39?
Well, because it is in a number of ways. I'm not a scholar, but I can read, and first of all, these chapters are anonymous. The prophet Isaiah is no longer mentioned. Again, if I recall correctly, there was a certain Rabbi Tuvia Singer who made a big deal about the problem of attribution for anonymous works. And you can't say, well, it's part of the same book, so obviously it's the same Isaiah writing. That is what we are trying to establish. Is it part of the same book? Was it all composed by the same person, or were two or more different works stitched together? Also, in these chapters, we first start hearing about the nation of Israel personified as a servant. We get a variety of new imagery, including Yahweh as maker and planner of everything in the world, Yahweh's exclusive divinity, the utter incomparability of Yahweh, change of vocabulary. The word nachem, or comfort, is used only once in the sense of comforting Israel in the first 39 chapters. In chapters 40 to 66, more than 10 times. It's not a figment of scholars' imaginations. And these chapters no longer have the tenor of oracles that the earlier chapters do. They have much more sense of immediacy. Something amazing is about to happen. The redemption is right now. And there's something else. Yes, the reference to Cyrus is a dead giveaway that this was written later. But let's let Rabbi Singer continue.
Now, in that 1 through 39 is, a lot of criticism, and 40 through 66 is a lot of comfort. Now, it is true there's a lot of comfort in 40 through 66, and a lot of Peranius is a lot of consternation. There's a lot of criticism, but it doesn't work, because there's a lot of comfort and messianic prophecy in those first 39 chapters. Moreover, they get themselves in all kinds of trouble, because Isaiah in chapter 12 clearly, it's not the only place, speaks about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So in the very part they want to ascribe to the original Isaiah, contains information about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So we use the term Babylonian Empire as like the Babylonian Empire that lasted for 7 decades. But there was the real Babylonian Empire was 1,000 years before that. But in the Bible, we're not concerned about that. We're concerned about the Neo-Babylonian. So you get yourself in all kinds of trouble.
Okay, all kinds of trouble again. Let's see what trouble chapter 12 has. I'm going to read the whole thing. Isaiah chapter 12. In that day you shall say, I give thanks to you, O Lord. Although you were wroth with me, your wrath has turned back, and you comfort me. Behold the God who gives me triumph. I am confident, unafraid. For Yah, the Lord, is my strength and might, and he has been my deliverance. Joyfully shall you draw water from the fountains of triumph, and you shall say on that day, Praise the Lord, proclaim his name, make his deeds known among the peoples. Declare that his name is exalted, him the Lord, for he has done gloriously. Let this be made known in all the world. O shout for joy, who dwell in Zion, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. That is chapter 12. So, if Rabbi Singer regards something I just read as anachronistic for the proposed dating of 1st Isaiah to the 700s, I wish he would be more specific about what it is. Just saying big trouble doesn't really give anyone much to go on.
Moreover, Isaiah is written in a way that is so choppy, it's so incohesive, where it changes from one verse to the next. The whole flavor, the whole sound changes. And that's why I'm teaching the book of Isaiah. But the book of Isaiah is not the book of Judges, is not the book of Joshua, which is very cohesive, is written in a chronological order, is using standard prose. There's virtually no poetry in the book of Joshua. Okay? There's very little poetry in the Torah. There is, but very little of it. Isaiah is all poetry, with the exception of 5 chapters, which means less than 10% of the book. So you can't apply that methodology to the book of Isaiah. And the reason they have to state that Isaiah was written by multiple authors is because if all of Isaiah was written 2,700 years ago during the Assyrian Empire, then it had to be divinely inspired. Because how could someone living during the Assyrian Empire, during the heat of the Assyrian Empire, know anything about the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire? That's not possible.
Correct. That's not possible. The reasonable explanation adopted by scholars, therefore, is that parts of the book that accurately describe a certain historical period were written in that period. Rabbi Singer makes it sound like the academics are pulling a fast one here. He seems to suggest that the book of Isaiah is obviously a genuine prophecy of the future, but the academics cannot tolerate the idea of actual prophecy. They cannot accept the obvious truth of Isaiah's foreknowledge, so they slyly confabulate other scenarios to explain the book. Well, sure, they are going to look for other scenarios other than actual mysterious foreknowledge. But there's nothing sketchy about it. That's how scholarship works. If you see a story of supernatural activity, such as those that fill the annals of ancient religious traditions, of a man lifting a mountain, walking on water, vanishing into thin air, rising from the dead, flying through the heavens, breathing underwater, turning into an animal, walking through fire, or knowing future events that are impossible to know, your starting assumption is going to be that these are myths, not truths. And depending on the context, As a scholar, you will look for the most plausible explanation of the narrative that you have. Generally, when it comes to folklore and religious texts, that will turn to exaggeration, deception, misreporting, embellishment, outright fiction, and the like. You would ask yourself, what is more likely, that a man actually walked on water, or that someone made up a story of a man walking on water? I think any unbiased person can answer this rather easily. Human beings are expert storytellers, not expert water walkers. We love to hear an exciting, incredible story. We love to tell an exciting, incredible story. Our most profitable industries are based around storytelling. Even in politics and news, it's always a question of what is the narrative? What is the story? Storytelling is in our DNA. So when you have to decide between did a supernatural event actually occur, or did someone tell a story about a supernatural event occurring, you've got to know which is more likely. And Rabbi Tuvia Singer certainly knows which is more likely, except oddly when it comes to Jewish stories. What's true for other supernatural abilities is true for prophecy as well. If you see a tale of supernatural abilities, you are going to look for an alternative explanation other than just assuming the truth of the story. Jesus didn't actually come back to life. Isaiah didn't actually have knowledge from 200 years in the future. The most plausible explanation is that the book was written after the time in which the story is set. And it's not like scholars are pulling the idea of late authorship out of their asses. If you see a story in which a prophet makes some fantastically accurate prophecies, and others of his prophecies are vague or just complete crap, then it's only reasonable to say, I think I see what's going on here. The author has set the book in the past and writes with accuracy about his own present. I mean, it's really no different than what you find in any time travel story. The narrative of the author's present is always the most vivid and true to life. Narratives set in the distant past are often in error, both in large and small ways, as scholars of those periods are quick to point out, and narratives of the future usually miss the mark hilariously. Think of 2001 Space Odyssey or Buck Rogers.
It follows, so they're forced. And to say that there's a literary difference is insane. That will be very persuasive to someone taking a course at Yale Divinity School in Old Testament. The student will be very persuaded by that. But people who really know Isaiah...
Which people would those be? I think the only point of this digression is for Rabbi Singer to say that he knows Isaiah, and all those academic scholars, well, they don't. Sure, those scholars have written books and made translations and presented papers and taught at premier universities around the world and in Israel, but they don't understand Isaiah like Rabbi Singer understands Isaiah. But you know what? I think they do. If Michael Fishbane says there's an abrupt shift in Isaiah 40, I think he's actually read Isaiah, and I think he knows what poetry is and all that. If Benjamin Sommer says that chapter 40 and later reflect a new setting, I think he's probably read Isaiah pretty thoroughly too, and I don't think he was deceived by sitting in a class at Yale Divinity School or whatever. If Mark Tzvi Bretler says there's probably 3 authors in the book of Isaiah, and even Isaiah 1 to 39 is not a single author, I think he's done his homework on the topic. I'm pretty sure that academic scholars know everything Rabbi Singer knows about Isaiah and a good deal more. So I'm not buying the whole thing that I'm Rabbi Singer and only I know how to read Isaiah.
Will tell you, you could just look it up for yourself, that all Isaiah is doing is swinging back and forth from extreme criticism to sweeping numinous messianic prophecy, and then back again within one verse. Okay, so Isaiah is always doing that. If you don't know that, you're going to be very persuaded by this secular academic world that cannot have all of Isaiah written by Isaiah. One other point, Isaiah did not edit his book during his lifetime because Isaiah was murdered. He was an old man, but typically prophets would gather and edit their work at the end of their lives. Isaiah was murdered by his grandson Manasseh. You didn't have a chance to. And Hezekiah, his son-in-law, a king who reigned during the time of Isaiah, would go on to edit a number of books in Tanakh, but germane to us, he edited the book of Isaiah. So you have a later editor. That's why. And when it comes to the book of Daniel, it's because
You have a later editor, and that's why what? That's why it looks like it's multiple authors? I thought you just said it doesn't look like it's multiple authors. It doesn't, but if it does, then it was a later editor? Well, if that's so kosher, then why not just say there were multiple authors at multiple times who wrote the parts that correspond to those time periods? I don't get it. What does the later editor buy you? And now we're on to Daniel. But before that, let's just try to understand what Rabbi Singer's answer to the caller actually was. So although the caller didn't mention Isaiah, I think Rabbi Singer understood the caller's question to be, why do you not follow modern scholarship in identifying 2 or 3 authors for the book of Isaiah? And Rabbi Singer's answer seems to have 2 parts. Number 1, academic scholars have not actually read Isaiah, and the evidence they think there is for multiple authorship does not actually exist at all. I find this completely unconvincing, as I said. His second argument seems to be that the only reason they claim to find this shift in tone and style starting in chapter 40 is so they can date this part of the book to the time period that corresponds to the information it contains, such as mention of Cyrus and exiles returning to Judah, and to avoid attributing mysterious foreknowledge to the text. But like I said, to me that seems totally reasonable, not some kind of trick. You date the composition of a work to when the evidence suggests it was composed. I actually think the question should be better posed not to the academics, but to Rabbi Singer. Why do you date chapters 40 and onward to the Assyrian Empire? They don't state that they were written by the prophet Isaiah, and they appear to be written in and about a later period when Cyrus has already issued or is about to issue his ruling, when exiles are already returning and rebuilding Judah. Is the only reason that you date these chapters earlier so that you can have your Cyrus prophecy? If we date it late, then we don't get the superhuman foreknowledge, and somehow that ruins everything for you? Well, that sounds like an entirely ideological motivation to me. Anyway, back to Daniel. The caller did ask about Daniel, so let's listen again.
Very good, Rabbi. We're going to go and move on to the next caller. Max, you are live on the air. Please go ahead with your question.
Awesome. I just want to say thank you, Rabbi, for everything you do. You've been a huge inspiration for me. But the question that I want to ask is, you talk a lot about how the academic consensus on the Old Testament is that it's written by multiple authors, sometimes 100 to 200 years after the supposed events of Christ's life. But then how do you also say that the Tanakh is the inspired word of God when those same academics turn around and say, well, there were actually 4 authors of the Chumash, and Daniel's written several centuries later, and there's revisions in Deuteronomy? Thank you.
So the caller's question about Daniel is not crystal clear to me, and I really wish he would have stayed with the Pentateuch because, frankly, who cares about Daniel? The only thing that really matters for a Jew's faith is who wrote the Pentateuch. I don't care who wrote Daniel, but I'm guessing the caller means that if Daniel was written centuries after the time in which it is set, then it casts doubt on the Tanakh as the Word of God. I'm not really sure it does. I mean, Daniel is just one book, and it's not critical to anything theologically, at least not for Jews today. In the Jewish arrangement of the Old Testament, Daniel is not placed together with the prophetic writings, and most religious Jews probably haven't even read it. But whatever. The caller asked the question, so let's see what Rabbi Singer has to say on Daniel.
Daniel, even more than Isaiah, contains massive evidence for its authorship during the Babylonian Empire.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have an eyewitness account for Daniel during the Babylonian exile, namely Ezekiel, where Daniel's mentioned 3 times passingly in both chapter 14 and 28.
Wow, an eyewitness account for Daniel. Daniel is mentioned 3 times passingly in Ezekiel. Now we are getting somewhere. Let's see the eyewitness accounts. So in the first one, God is saying that if a land were to sin against him, even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, should be in it, they would by their righteousness save only themselves. In the second instance, God is saying, if he lets loose a pestilence against that land, should Noah, Daniel, and Job be in it, they would save neither son nor daughter, they would save themselves alone by their righteousness. And in the third case, it says, yes, you are wiser than Daniel. In no hidden matter can anyone compare to you. Well, that is a bit of a letdown. So, first of all, the name in Ezekiel is not spelled the same way as Daniel or Daniel. It's missing a letter, so it's more like Daniel. Maybe it's the same name, maybe not. But more importantly, it's not an eyewitness account of anything. It's just mentioning a famous character and mentioning him alongside such legendary characters as Job and Noah, who are clearly mythological. All this demonstrates is that the author of the book of Ezekiel was familiar with a mythological name by the name of Daniel or Daniel, which would not be surprising if Daniel or Daniel was some kind of folktale character, perhaps the same Daniel from the Ugaritic tale of Akkad. Who really knows? He's certainly not referring to him as if he just met him Tuesday for breakfast. I mean, if I said, that guy is tougher than Achilles or Hercules or Daniel, you would not think that Daniel is the guy who lives down the block from me. And even if Daniel and Daniel were the same name, and even if Ezekiel wrote, hey, you know, I just had a great breakfast with Daniel Tuesday morning, without some additional information, why would you conclude that this is the same Daniel from the book of Daniel? Was there only one Daniel in the ancient world? I mean, it probably wasn't every third person like it is in Jewish communities today, but there's no reason to think there was just one. Honestly here, if you are going to say that Ezekiel is an eyewitness to Daniel based on these verses, then you can sure as hell go ahead and say that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts of Jesus. I mean, if they were written by someone who was alive at the time of Jesus or shortly after, and they say Jesus did this thing and that thing, that is a hell of a lot better testimony for Jesus than a quote from Ezekiel is for Daniel that says, don't you know about those great men, Noah, Job, and Daniel? I think what we need is a lot more clarity on what Rabbi Singer considers to be witnesses. He says many times that the authors of the Gospels were not witnesses to events in Jesus' life because of the authorship dates. Okay, but what about the disciples who saw Jesus after he died in those works? Were they witnesses? If not, why not? I mean, I would say not, because they are merely characters in a story. What we have is a story about someone witnessing something. If you tell a story about someone witnessing an alien abduction, that doesn't mean the event happened. It's a story. The abduction and the witnessing are both part of the same fictional story. Now, this seems really plain to me, but I'm not sure that Rabbi Singer draws the line in the same place if he thinks that Ezekiel merely mentioning a character named Daniel is some kind of eyewitness event. And listen to how he talks about witnessing the revelation at Sinai in a different video.
The reason why we know the Torah is from Hashem and why it is unique, distinct, is because of the nature of its revelation, in that the revelation was given before an entire nation rather than an individual who said, take my word for it, or else it wouldn't be distinct. But rather, the entire nation was there and heard the voice of God.
I hope to comment on that video in the future, but who exactly were the witnesses? What were their names? Where are their accounts? Is he going to say that Aaron and the elders witnessed Moses going up on the mountain and therefore it actually happened? This is like saying that Peter Pan actually defeated Captain Hook because Wendy and the Lost Boys witnessed it. The Empire's Death Star actually destroyed the planet Alderaan because Princess Leia witnessed it. It reflects some kind of complete unawareness of how stories work, and kind of defies belief. So I really wish that Rabbi Singer would lay out his rules for what constitutes a witness to an event. This would clarify so much, I think, and make it much easier to determine whether his critiques of the Gospels are fair. From what I've heard so far, I think probably not. I mean, if I were a Christian, I would say, wait a minute. You call a story of anonymous people allegedly seeing something 1,000 years ago an eyewitness account, but a story of named individuals seeing something 50 years ago is unreliable? That is complete bullshit. Well, anyway, let's move on.
We have an eyewitness account for Daniel as an ancient book during a time when it is said it was written as a pseudepigrapha. I mean, that can't be the case because of 1 Maccabees 2:55 through 60, where the author of 1 Maccabees.
Right. So after a long list of famous personalities, Abraham, Joseph, Elijah, Caleb, David, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, we get a blurb about Daniel. Daniel, because of his innocence, was delivered from the lions.
Is written during the time of Hanukkah, during the time of the Seleucid Empire, during the time when the Maccabean army defeated the Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Okay, that's universally. It was originally written in Biblical Hebrew. It does not survive in Biblical Hebrew. It only survives through the Septuagint, but it was originally written in Hebrew.
Okay. It's funny that Rabbi Singer mentions that because often he cites the lack of original manuscripts to throw doubt on a textual tradition. But in this case, I guess it's all fine that we have just the Greek translation, and we just assume it has not been tampered with in any way. So, fine. Let's hear what problem Rabbi Singer finds in Maccabees for a late-dated Daniel.
But it is the absolute consensus. The book of Maccabees was written during that time, and the author is recounting, so you get the context, in times long past when God had delivered the Jewish people and saints of the Jewish people, and among these great deliverances is looking back to when Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah were delivered from the fiery furnace, when Daniel was delivered from a den of lions in Daniel chapter 6. So we have...
Yes, the author of Maccabees is recounting a story of times long past, just like the author of the book of Daniel is doing. If Daniel was a character known from folklore, which is what the hodgepodge of stories in the book of Daniel and apocryphal books such as Bel and the Dragon and Susanna seem to suggest, then the writers of the 2nd century were writing down stories about Daniel that they had heard, or were creating new stories about that character. It's not so hard to understand. I mean, I don't imagine Rabbi Singer actually watches superhero movies, but just picture Rabbi Singer watching Thor Ragnarok. Would he claim that this movie could not possibly have been made in 2017 because Thor Love and Thunder was made in 2022 and refers to Thor as if he is an ancient character, not a character that was invented 5 years earlier? I don't think he'd really have this problem. I think Rabbi Singer probably realizes that different authors can write about the same persona, the same character. It's not mysterious.
A mountain of evidence for when the book of Daniel is written.
Well, yeah, but the mountain of evidence points to a late authorship date, unless you are committed to believing that this is really a prophecy. But in that case, you kind of have to ask why some of the prophecies are accurate and some aren't, why the book of Daniel wasn't included among the canonical prophets and is just kind of tacked on to the end of the Bible. Most likely, at the time the Bible was canonized, the book was not yet known as a discrete work.
So, yeah, I use the same standards. So, first of all, for the authorship of Lahavdil, of the Christian Bible, my views are more in line with evangelical Christians than they are with the academic world.
So now we're into his overall summary, but let's just summarize what he says about Daniel. To the caller's question of why he doesn't follow scholarly dating for Daniel, his main defense is that other people also knew of the ancient character known as Daniel or Daniel. The ancient book of Ezekiel mentions him, and the later book of Maccabees mentions him as being an ancient character. So therefore, the book describing his exploits must have existed in ancient times, says Rabbi Singer. But like I said, all that would be entirely expected if Daniel was a popular folk hero of some kind. The author of Daniel could write about him, the author of Maccabees could write about him, the author of Ezekiel could write about him, the author of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon could write about him. None of these provides any indication of when these books were written. Am I totally making things up by suggesting that Daniel was a legendary figure? I don't think so. That is the sense that you get when you read the book of Daniel, even putting aside the apocryphal works of Susanna and Bel and the Dragon. The early chapters of Daniel read as if they are independent works. We are reminded time and again that Daniel and Belteshazzar are the same person, as though we wouldn't have known that from a page earlier. And the story through line is almost non-existent. The early chapters are just vignettes. At the end of the vignette in chapter 1, we're told that Daniel and his friends became King Nebuchadnezzar's chief wise men, 10 times better than all the other wise men, and that Daniel did this gig until the first years of Cyrus, so that would be about 540 BC. Since the story starts in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, this suggests that Daniel was advising the kings of Babylon from about 606 BC to 540 BC. That sounds like the end of this story. In chapter 2, we are in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar, which would be about 603 BC, and Daniel seems to have no special status with the king, and the king doesn't even think to consult with Daniel about his dream. That's odd. At the end of this chapter, after Daniel's successful dream interpretation, King Nebuchadnezzar names Daniel's God as the ultimate God, and makes Daniel governor of Babylon and chief of all the wise men, again. Daniel's buddies are appointed to administer Babylon, and Daniel remains at the king's court. In chapter 3, which is undated, not only is Daniel not at the king's court, but Daniel is not even mentioned. Here, Nebuchadnezzar becomes furious with Daniel's friends because they worship their own God. There is no recollection that in the previous chapter Nebuchadnezzar declared this God to be the ultimate God or anything of that nature. In fact, he says, "What God can save you from my power?" You might think that Daniel's friends might say something like, "Well, it's Daniel's God, and there's Daniel standing right there." But no. So then we have the famous fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar is again very impressed by the God of the Jews, and he promotes Daniel's friends in Babylon, which they were already administering anyway, we were to suppose. Chapter 4, also undated, is narrated from the standpoint of Nebuchadnezzar. Now Daniel is no longer governor or wise man, but chief magician. In chapter 5, we abruptly switch to the reign of King Belshazzar, who is presented as Nebuchadnezzar's son, although this is historically incorrect. Historically, Belshazzar might have ruled from 553 to 543, so we've jumped into the future about 50 years, almost to the time of Cyrus. This king seems completely unaware of Daniel's existence, but some people in the kingdom do apparently remember Daniel as having been a magician to the father, whom the author thinks is Nebuchadnezzar, but was actually Nabonidus. Daniel succeeds with his interpretation and is appointed to rule as one of 3, it says. In chapter 6, we transition to the reign of Darius the Mede, who is totally unknown from history, and Darius appears to appoint Daniel again as one of 3 ministers. We get the famous vignette of Daniel in the lion's den, and now there is a royal order that everyone must tremble in fear of the God of Daniel. I think we know how long that will last. And it concludes by saying that Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and Cyrus. No mention of how his friends made out or if they even existed. So it sounds like we're done because the first chapter said that Daniel was around until the first years of Cyrus, and now here we are. But in chapter 7 we are back again to the first year of King Belshazzar, and now everything switches to Daniel first person, and he just relates his own disturbing visions. From here on we leave all the narrative behind and go full first person prophecy. Daniel is not advising, governing, magicking, or hanging out with his friends. He is just prophesizing. This is basically a new kind of Daniel, Daniel the prophet. Chapter 8 is the third year of Belshazzar, and Daniel relates another first-person vision. Chapter 9, we are back to Darius the Mede, who is erroneously referred to as the son of Ahasuerus, and we get a kind of prayer from Daniel and some more prophecy. In chapter 10, we jump to the third year of Cyrus for the end times vision, and chapter 11 and 12 are a continuation. So the nature of the work itself suggests Daniel was an ancient character about whom people told stories, probably orally, probably filled with lots of erroneous historical information, and which eventually were written down and compiled. If that's the case, there's no surprise that the character of Daniel was known to various authors, and it's no surprise that the book of Daniel was not canonized in Tanakh with the prophets. It didn't exist as a book yet when the canonization was taking place. And if you wanted to put prophecies in the mouth of some ancient figure, Daniel would be a very good choice. He wouldn't have been known to people as a prophet, but if people knew stories about Daniel as a wise man, magician, dream interpreter, lion tamer, then there's pretty fertile ground to put prophecy in his mouth as well. And that's probably what happened, and it explains why some of the information of the book is confused, some of it is historically accurate, and some of it is completely wrong. Okay, so let's move on.
Because it's the letters of Paul are very interesting. First, the letters of Paul state that Paul wrote them. I mean, that doesn't mean it's true.
Right. That doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean anything, because anyone could have written that.
But the letters of Paul, I mean, Hebrews does not say that, Paul wrote it. And very few people today believe that Hebrews was written by Paul. But the 13 letters of Paul, the claim is in the book that this is an epistle, a letter of Paul. Well, that doesn't prove it, but that's contributing evidence.
No, if anyone could have written that, and people did frequently write works and attribute them to other authors, then it's not actually contributing evidence, or it contributes very little. It certainly cannot possibly carry any more weight than any other claim in the book.
And moreover, it's widely believed that Paul had co-editors.
Widely believed by who? Traditional Christians? Academic scholars? I don't mean to be a nudnik, but if the whole point of your discussion here is to lay out whether you are following modern scholarship or not, I think you have to stop saying things like lots of people think, and it's widely believed, or it's well known. That just obscures the whole issue. Who knows? Who thinks? Who believes? Do any of these people have names?
So, and during the first century, Paul's letters were rewritten, edited, stitched together. 2 Corinthians is not one letter, it's really multiple letters that was sewn together. I mean, this is consensus stuff, right? We have in Romans 16, where we have Tertius, openly, we are told in the book, co-wrote the book. So I don't know why people... So my views about the time of the authorship of the majority of the New Testament books is in line with, much more in line with conservative Christians than it is with the academic world. My dating for the most important books, and I date Hebrews at about 64, which is absolute consensus. I date the Gospels between 70 and 95, which is right down the middle.
Okay, so Rabbi Singer really wants us to know that he is more in line with Christians, but when he says, I date this book, I date this letter, I date this chapter, I would think what the caller wanted to know is, why do you date it that way? On the basis of what method? Is it on Christian tradition, or is it using techniques of modern scholarship? Isn't that the crucial thing here? Isn't that what the caller wants to know? Rabbi Singer seems to be saying that he uses the Rabbi Singer method, but what is that?
The only thing is, I believe that the evidence against the Pauline authorship of Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, I think is too thin. And it's very easy to explain why these letters would be using different language, different words, a different lexicon than other books, because there were people who went over the book and edited and therefore you find those differences. But the evidence for Pauline authorship is very, very strong, in my view. And there are many New Testament scholars that agree with me and many who don't.
Okay, at this point, I'm not getting anything because I'm not seeing the academic method, the traditional method, or the Rabbi Singer method. So what am I supposed to get from this? I mean, he seems to be presenting himself here as a New Testament scholar, and I have no idea what his credentials are in this area. I mean, has he done manuscript research? Does he read ancient Greek? I have no idea. So when he keeps saying, my opinion is this, my opinion is that, this really means nothing to me.
That's why the 7 letters of Paul are called the indisputed. There's a reason why the term is indisputed, because virtually no one disputes that Romans and Galatians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians were written by Paul. I mean, it's not like no one. There are people who think only 4 of them were. There are, but those are outliers. So, no, I look at them, One other point I think I should make, and that is Christians get into trouble because they make claims about eyewitness, that the New Testament eyewitness accounts. If they don't do that, just say, look, it's an article of faith.
Okay, so here we go again. They get into trouble. What kind of trouble do they get into? I think we need to hear this more clearly, and I suspect this is exactly what the caller wants to hear as well.
That's fine. I mean, for me, it's an article of faith that the first 24 chapters of 1 Samuel were written or co-written by the prophet Samuel. I can't prove it. Clearly, from 1 Samuel 25 on, the prophet Samuel couldn't have written it because he died.
Okay, great. So, is it also an article of faith that Moses wrote the Bible?
So it's really simple. But I don't say you should believe in Samuel because Samuel wrote it, or you should believe in Joshua because Joshua wrote it.
Wait, you don't? I thought the whole deal for you was knowing who wrote it, and that there be valid witnessing and all that. Does that not matter?
Because that's silly. What's my evidence? It's just an article of faith. I would never use it as an apologetic. And that's where Christians get into trouble. Why? Because they're bad? Because they're evil? No.
Whoa. But isn't that exactly what the caller asked you about? He did not ask you whether you disbelieve the multiple author theory as a matter of faith. He asked whether you follow modern scholarship to its understanding of the composition of Tanakh. So what is your answer? That you don't follow modern scholarship because it runs up against your faith?
Because this is what they hear from preachers and apologists and just presume it's true and regurgitate it when it's not correct. So my views are very much in line with what most evangelical Christians believe about the dating of most of the New Testament books, not authorship. There's no way in the world that I believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were authors of the books that bear that name. Anyways, thank you so much for your thoughtful question.
So let's review a minute. Caller asked whether, if you follow modern scholarship for the authorship of the Gospels, why do you not follow modern scholarship for the authorship of the Old Testament? And you spoke about eyewitnesses and prophecies and anonymous authorship, but now I'm hearing something completely different. What I'm hearing is that Christians are entitled to believe what they believe on faith, and Rabbi Tuvia Singer is entitled to believe what he believes on faith, and none of us care about what modern scholarship has to say about anything. We don't need any methods. I have my opinion, and you have your opinion. If that's Rabbi Singer's ultimate answer to the caller, that I believe certain things that I like to believe, I am super disappointed. I mean, if I'm that caller, I want to know, are you applying the same standards of scholarship to assessing the authorship of the New Testament and the Old Testament? The same standards of evidence for believing the New Testament and Old Testament? And what Rabbi Singer actually replies is that, well, I do my own scholarship, but I'm not going to share my methods, and I believe the Old Testament is true because of my faith, just like Christians believe the New Testament is true because of their faith. And that's it. I think the caller deserved a lot better.